Have you ever opened your laptop with every intention of getting something important done, only to find yourself cleaning your desk, checking your phone, watching random videos, or suddenly deciding that now is the perfect time to reorganize your entire life? You know the task matters. You know the deadline is coming. And yet somehow, nothing happens. Until the very last minute. Then something strange occurs. The same person who couldn't focus for an entire week suddenly becomes a productivity machine. Hours before the deadline, your brain locks in. Your focus sharpens. Your energy appears from nowhere. And somehow, you finish the task just in time. Most people believe this happens because they're lazy. Or undisciplined. Or bad at managing their time. But what if that's not actually true? What if procrastination isn't a problem of time management at all? What if your brain is following a hidden survival strategy that's been running beneath your awareness for years? Because the real reason you wait until the last minute has less to do with laziness and more to do with how your brain is designed. And once you understand what's really happening inside your mind, you'll start seeing procrastination in a completely different way. But here's the strange part. The thing your brain is trying to protect you from isn't the task itself. It's something much deeper. Think about the last important thing you delayed. Maybe it was a work project. A college assignment. A difficult conversation. A business idea you've wanted to start. Or even a simple email you've been avoiding for days. On the surface, these activities don't seem particularly threatening. They're not dangerous. They're not painful. They're often things you genuinely want to accomplish. Yet your brain treats them as if there's something to avoid. And that creates a frustrating cycle. You tell yourself you'll start tomorrow. Tomorrow arrives. You still don't start. The guilt begins to build. The pressure increases. The task becomes larger in your mind. And somehow, starting becomes even harder. What most people don't realize is that procrastination isn't usually about avoiding work. It's about avoiding feelings. When you look at an important task, your brain isn't just seeing the task. It's seeing uncertainty. Possibility of failure. Possibility of judgment. Possibility of not being good enough. Imagine you're about to write an important report. The report itself isn't painful. But the thought that it might not be good enough. That creates discomfort. The possibility that someone might criticize it. More discomfort. The fear that you'll discover you're not as capable as you hoped. Even more discomfort. And your brain hates discomfort. Especially immediate discomfort. So it offers a solution. A temporary escape. Check your phone. Watch one video. Scroll for a few minutes. Do literally anything else. And for a brief moment, the discomfort disappears. The task is still there. But the feeling is gone. At least temporarily. And that's where the trap begins. Because every time you escape the discomfort, your brain learns something important. Avoidance works. The uncomfortable feeling appeared. You avoided the task. The feeling went away. From your brain's perspective, that's a successful strategy. And this changes everything. Because now procrastination is no longer about productivity. It's become emotional regulation. Your brain is using delay as a tool to manage uncomfortable emotions. The problem is that the relief never lasts. The task remains unfinished. The deadline moves closer. And eventually the discomfort returns even stronger than before. But the real reason is even stranger. Because if avoiding discomfort is the goal, why does your brain suddenly become productive when the deadline gets close? Why can someone waste days procrastinating and then accomplish incredible amounts of work in a single night? The answer reveals one of the most fascinating quirks of human psychology. Your brain operates with two different clocks. One measures the present. The other measures the future. And they're terrible at communicating with each other. Imagine a person standing on a beach looking out at a distant storm. The storm exists. They know it's coming. But because it's far away, it doesn't feel urgent. That's how your brain sees future consequences. A deadline next week is intellectually real. But emotionally, it barely exists. Your future self is the one who will deal with it. Not you. At least that's what your brain believes. Psychologists call this temporal discounting. The further away a consequence feels, the less your brain cares about it. Immediate rewards become more attractive than future rewards. That's why scrolling social media feels easier than building a business. Why watching another episode feels easier than studying. Why comfort now often beats success later. Not because you're irrational. Because your brain evolved in environments where immediate concerns mattered most. Thousands of years ago, surviving today was more important than planning for 6 months from now. Your brain still carries traces of that ancient programming. But here's where it gets even more interesting. As the deadline approaches, something changes. The distant storm suddenly becomes immediate. The future transforms into the present. And your brain finally pays attention. What felt abstract now feels real. What felt optional now feels urgent. And urgency triggers powerful biological systems that have been mostly dormant. Inside your brain, a region called the prefrontal cortex is responsible for planning, decision-making, and long-term thinking. You can think of it as the CEO of the brain. Its job is to help you make choices that benefit your future self. But the prefrontal cortex doesn't operate alone. It constantly competes with older emotional systems that prioritize immediate comfort and immediate rewards. Every time you face a difficult task, these systems negotiate. The rational part says, we should start now. The emotional part says, maybe later. Most of the time, the emotional system wins. Especially when the reward is distant and the discomfort is immediate. But deadlines change the equation. As urgency rises, your brain begins releasing stress hormones. Now, stress has a terrible reputation. And chronic stress can absolutely be harmful. But moderate stress can temporarily enhance focus. Suddenly your brain realizes there is no more room to delay. The threat becomes immediate. Energy increases. Attention narrows. Distractions lose some of their appeal. The same brain that seemed incapable of concentrating 3 days ago suddenly becomes laser-focused. Not because it changed. Because the conditions changed. Your brain finally believes the threat is real. And that's why relying on last-minute pressure can become addictive. Many people accidentally train themselves to depend on urgency. Over time, they stop trusting motivation. They stop trusting routines. They stop trusting discipline. Instead, they trust panic. Panic becomes the engine that powers action. And while this strategy sometimes works, it comes with hidden costs. Costs that most people never notice. For starters, procrastination quietly consumes mental energy. Even when you're not actively working on the task, part of your brain keeps thinking about it. The unfinished project sits in the background like an open browser tab. You may be watching a movie, talking with friends, trying to relax. But some part of your attention remains occupied. The task is still there. Waiting. Researchers sometimes refer to this tendency as the brain's sensitivity to unfinished commitments. Your mind doesn't fully let go. Which means procrastination often feels like rest without actually providing rest. You're avoiding the work. But you're not escaping the mental burden. And that burden accumulates. Another hidden consequence is identity. Every time you repeatedly delay something important, you start telling yourself a story. I'm a procrastinator. I always do this. I can't stay disciplined. Those beliefs become dangerous. Because eventually, they stop describing behavior and start defining identity. Instead of saying, I procrastinated on this task, you begin saying, I am a procrastinator. And once a behavior becomes part of your identity, changing it becomes much harder. Because now you're not just fighting habits. You're fighting your self-image. But what most people don't realize is that procrastination says very little about your character. In fact, some of the most ambitious, intelligent, and successful people procrastinate. The difference is that they eventually learn what's happening beneath the surface. And once they understand the mechanism, they can interrupt it. Research has revealed something surprising about chronic procrastination. Many studies have found stronger connections between procrastination and emotional regulation than between procrastination and laziness. In other words, procrastination often has less to do with poor work ethic and more to do with how people respond to uncomfortable emotions. Fear, doubt, anxiety, perfectionism, Uncertainty. One especially interesting finding involves perfectionists. You might assume perfectionists would start tasks early. After all, they care about quality. But many perfectionists procrastinate constantly. Why? Because starting creates the possibility of imperfection. As long as the project remains unfinished, it still has potential. Once they begin, reality enters the picture. Mistakes become visible. Limitations become visible. And that can feel threatening. So they delay. Not because they don't care. Because they care too much. And this changes the way we think about procrastination. The battle isn't really between productivity and laziness. It's often between action and emotion. Between discomfort and avoidance. Between uncertainty and control. Which raises an important question. If procrastination is fueled by emotion, why do most productivity strategies focus entirely on time management? Why do people keep buying planners, calendars, and scheduling systems only to find themselves repeating the same cycle? Because they're trying to solve an emotional problem with a logistical solution. And that's why many of those solutions fail. The most effective way to break procrastination isn't to become more organized. It's to become more willing to experience discomfort. That sounds simple. But it's incredibly powerful. Because the goal isn't to eliminate resistance. The goal is to act while resistance exists. Most people wait until they feel motivated. But motivation is unreliable. Action creates motivation far more often than motivation creates action. What most people don't realize is that starting is usually the hardest part. Once momentum begins, the emotional barrier shrinks dramatically. The brain often exaggerates the pain of beginning. The anticipation is frequently worse than the experience itself. One useful strategy is reducing the size of the first step until it feels almost ridiculous. Not, write the report. Open the document. Not, study for 3 hours. Read 1 page. Not, build a business. Spend 5 minutes working on it. This works because you're lowering the emotional cost of starting. And once movement begins, momentum often takes over. Another powerful technique involves changing your relationship with discomfort. Instead of interpreting discomfort as a stop sign, treat it as evidence that something meaningful is happening. Discomfort isn't proof that you're on the wrong path. Sometimes it's proof that you're growing. The fear before an important project. The anxiety before a difficult conversation. The uncertainty before trying something new. These feelings aren't necessarily warnings. They're often the price of progress. And when you stop treating them as enemies, they lose much of their power. But here's the biggest shift of all. Stop asking, how do I feel? Start asking, what action comes next? Because feelings fluctuate. Action creates direction. People who consistently get things done aren't necessarily more motivated. They've simply learned not to negotiate with every emotion that appears. They understand that discomfort is temporary. But delay can last forever. And that's the irony at the center of procrastination. The behavior that promises relief often creates more suffering. The thing you're avoiding usually becomes heavier the longer you carry it. The email becomes scarier. The project becomes larger. The decision becomes harder. The future becomes more stressful. Until one day you realize the task itself was never the real problem. The real problem was the space you gave it to grow inside your mind. Your brain waits until the last minute because it wants certainty. It wants comfort. It wants to avoid discomfort right now. But life doesn't reward comfort nearly as much as it rewards action. The people who achieve remarkable things aren't the ones who never feel resistance. They're the ones who stop treating resistance as a reason to wait. Because in the end, procrastination isn't a time problem. It's a relationship with discomfort. And the moment you understand that, something remarkable happens. You stop seeing yourself as someone who lacks discipline. You stop waiting for the perfect mood. You stop expecting fear to disappear before you begin. And you realize that courage isn't the absence of discomfort. It's moving forward while discomfort is still there. The deadline doesn't create your ability. The panic doesn't create your focus. Those things were already inside you. The deadline simply forced your brain to use them. The question is no longer why your brain waits until the last minute. The real question is this. What could happen if you stopped waiting for the deadline, and started trusting that ability today?